And good afternoon. Thank you for attending. More people are coming in. Yes, let's turn off the lights. Okay, lights down. You can see Jerry Lewis. Yes, good afternoon. My name is Evan Weiner, and my cousin was Jerry Stiller and is Ben Stiller. Whoops. And yeah, that's fine. And this talk came out of just speaking to one of my friends, a guy named Max Docelli, who's a comedian, and gave me a lot of help on this talk. And I said, you know, I should do a woman's talk, because being a stand-up comic is not a woman's game, or at least wasn't a woman's game way back when. And Max broke in the late 1970s with some of his contemporaries you might have heard of: Jerry Seinfeld, Larry David, Paul Reiser, and Gilbert Gottfried, four of them, and Carol Leifler, one woman, four guys, one woman, and they were part of the Carolines crowd in Manhattan. And Max said, being a comic is a tough life. It's a really tough life, especially for a woman. In fact, I asked Max one day, I said, is being a comic a respectable profession? He said, no, we're comics. Jerry Lewis, and here you'll see why women had a difficult time being comics. Jerry Lewis in the late 1940s with Dean Martin, top of the game, right? Nobody bigger than Martin and Lewis. There weren't any real big female comics at that time, stand-ups anyway, except for Jean Carroll. Jerry Lewis's comments about women comics. At the U.S. Comedy Arts Festival, Aspen, Colorado in 2000, during a question and answer period conducted by Martin Short, Lewis was asked whether he liked Lucille Ball. Jerry Lewis is 75 years old at this point. A woman doing comedy doesn't offend me, but it sets me back a bit. I, as a viewer, have trouble with it. I think of her as a producing machine that brings babies into the world. At the Cannes Film Festival in 2013, Lewis is 88 years old at this point, and he's asked about women comics. He says, it bothers me. I can't sit and watch a lady diminish her qualities to the lowest common denominator. I just can't do it. But he has a change of mind when he's 89 years old, a year afterwards. And he talked about Lucille Ball as brilliant, and Carol Burnett as the greatest female entrepreneur of comedy. By the way, how many Carol Burnett fans are in here? Okay, a few. In about 2 weeks on NBC, there will be a special program with Julie Andrews and Cher highlighting Carol Burnett's 90th birthday. So watch your local TV listings for the time and channel in your area, and this will of course be Channel 4 WNBC in the New York area. Comics have a hard time. So do funny looking people who are trying to make it big, like Sophie Tucker, the last of the Red Hot Bombers. Jewish singer, debuted in 1906 in vaudeville acts. She performed in blackface. Why blackface? Well, she was overweight and too unattractive to sing as a white woman. She turned to comedy bits as part of her singing. She was successful in blackface. She despised the form and wanted to vary her act. She found out that audiences like suggestive content of her racier songs. You will find there are 5 other Jewish women who turned to that to be comics later on in the 20th century. She attributed her ability to amuse rather than scandalize because of her large figure, which flouted traditional notions of female beauty and restraint. She performed songs like "Make Him Say Please," "No Man Is Ever Going to Make Me Worry," and "You Gotta Make It Legal, Mr. Sagal." Part of her appeal, the songs came from blended roots. She grew up on traditional Jewish music, as well as African American blues and bawdy songs. And she was influenced by black clubs in Harlem, Cotton Club, etc., the Apollo in New York and Chicago, and was influenced by double entendres in the lyrics of Bessie Smith and Ma Rainey. She is the first stand-up comic. Jackie Moms Mabley. She is thought of as the first stand-up comic, except she's not thought of it in that vein because she was on the Chitlin circuit. She was not in mainstream because she was black. Moms Mabley was the first successful female stand-up comic. Her vaudeville and comic career and TV career spanned 50 years. She was also the first woman comic ever to play the Apollo Theater in 1930 and Carnegie Hall in 1962. She was the first openly gay comedian. She wore men's suits on her Christmas cards. Her friends called her Mr. Moms. And back in the days of the Apollo, she would dress like Cab Calloway. The only time I met Cab Calloway was at the Greenberg Library in White Plains. And I was about 26, 27, and I had been in the radio business for about 11, 12 years at that time. I thought I was totally jaded. So I see Cab Calloway, and I'm like, and I look at him, and I said, Mr. Calloway, what are you doing here? And he looked at me and he said, same thing you are, taking out books. The Apollo mourns Moms Mabley, or Harlem mourns Moms Mabley. She ran away from home, moved to Cleveland when she was 14. And she was under the wing of a vaudeville act called Butter Beans and Susie, who had a song called I Want Your Hot Dog in My Roll. What does that mean? You're laughing at that. Whatever I wanted to think of it. She performed on the Chitlin circuit. Max was telling me a story about the Chitlin circuit. He said that Red Fox was on it. And Red Fox used to get his money paid in cash on the table, and Max opened for Red. And he said that basically what was done there was the money was thrown on the table. And Red counted, and this is even in Las Vegas, and Max said, why? He said, because when you were on the Chitlin circuit, they would be like this. They'd pull their pockets out. We have no money for you. So Red said, you have no money for me. I'm not performing. So he made sure that the money was there. So did Moms Mabley, and he counted 5s, 10s. And he went to 5s, 10s, and 1s because he didn't trust 20s because they could be counterfeit. Anyway, so she in 1930 played the Apollo, doing 5 shows a day along comedy greats like Pigmeat Markham. You ever hear of Pigmeat Markham? Ever watch Rowan and Martin's Laughing? Here come the judge. Here come the judge. Oh, yeah. That was Pigmeat Markham. 1933, she was with Paul Robeson in a movie called Emperor Jones. And there she is. Her character was modeled after her great-grandmother, who was a former slave. Her style was clever, wise, and filled with raunchy humor. She wore frumpy, mismatched dresses and would take her teeth out. Another singer-comedian was Martha Raye. And I know a guy named Jerry Ring, who was one of Liberace's proteges. He says he's performing one day with Martha Raye, and they really didn't have much of a rehearsal. And in the middle of the act, she pops out her teeth, puts it in into a glass filled with vodka, starts singing and puts the teeth back in, saying that tastes better with the vodka, and continued singing. Anyway, her signature line, Moms Mabley, ain't nothing an old man can do but bring me a message from a young man. Her old lady persona gave her the ability to joke about edgy topics, sex, race, politics, and she had a gravelly voice, a gravel voice that made anything sound funny. She doesn't get to TV until 1967. Why? She's a black comic. But she finally gets on TV in 1967 on ABC's Stage 67. She played the maid in The Time for Laughter, a look at Negro humor in America, which starred Godfrey Cambridge. I don't know if you remember him or not. Heavy-set, funny comic. And then she did the circuit, the Smothers Brothers, Ed Sullivan, Merv Griffin, Mike Douglas. So she got around finally in her old age. She influenced people like Richard Pryor, Red Fox, Whoopi Goldberg, Eddie Murphy. In the remake of Jerry Lewis's Nutty Professor in 1996, one of his characters, Eddie Murphy played every character in the film. The grandmother was modeled after Mom's Maid. Take a good look at this woman and tell me if you know her. Jean Carroll. Anybody ever hear of Jean Carroll? Anybody ever watch Ed Sullivan?
Yes.
She was on Ed Sullivan more than 24 times. By the way, my cousin, Jerry Stiller, and his wife, Ann Mira, who's the brains of the family, were on more than 36 times Ed Sullivan, and Jerry told me a lot of stuff about Sullivan. Anyway, by the way, compare her to Phyllis Diller, Tony Fields, Joan Rivers. Is she a good-looking woman or not? Good-looking woman. She broke the stereotype. She totally broke the stereotype. Jean Carroll was one of the first women to make it as a solo stand-up comedian. She was born Celine Zegman, 1911, and began her career in vaudeville, performing as a duo with her husband, Buddy Howe. He went off to fight the war, World War II, and he told her to continue. And she continued, and he became her manager. She was basically, remember Alan King? Yes. She's basically Alan King, female version of Alan King. She made her first appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show, which was called Toast to the Town, when he started in 1948 on TV. She was on the Sullivan Show more than 20 times over a 20-year period. Ultimately served as a prototype for comics such as Joan Rivers and Lily Tomlin. She even had her own TV show. If you blinked your eye, you would have missed it. It was called Take It From Me. And there she is on the right, and Alan Courtney is the husband, and Lynn Lauren is the daughter of the 1953 TV show. But it was on a very weak network. Paramount owned ABC in those days. It was really only there were only two TV networks that mattered, the CBS and NBC. Dumont was dying, and this Paramount wouldn't become successful until ABC did a deal with Walt Disney. They put money into Disneyland, and Walt Disney promised them two shows. One, a show on Disneyland, and the other show you might have heard of, I don't know, Mickey Mouse Club?
Yeah.
That made ABC profitable. Anyway, the Jean Carroll Show was on in 1953, and if it sounds vaguely familiar to you, it was about a stand-up comic and the life that the stand-up comic had off stage, which basically was the premise of another show called Seinfeld later on. She's a beleaguered housewife, and her performances were widely accepted as good, but the writing was terrible. The show was only on for 11 episodes, and only 11 episodes because they could not get any sponsors, but ABC only had 14 stations back then. There she is, the nation's #1 comedian playing the Paramount, and this has to be, I figure, about 1951, this ad. The Chesterfield Supper Club, starring Perry Como, she was on that. Toast to the Town, Ed Sullivan. Along with the Texaco Star Theater, Milton Berle, the #1 show at that time, so she was well known. And also the very new Cavalcade of Stars on the Dumont Network featuring Jackie Gleason. So I figure this is about 1951. She wrote all of her own material. She found the humor in everyday stuff like clothing and shopping and social life and family. But in her day, women were not stand-up comics. They were not stand-up comics. Men thought this was no place for a woman. A smoke-filled nightclub, a woman isn't tough enough or brave enough to be in a smoke-filled club. There were some female entertainers before her, like Gracie Allen, but she worked vaudeville with George Burns. Almost nobody, except for Moms Mabley, socialized in nightclub act. She was attractive, and I bring that up that she's attractive because look at Moms Mabley, look at Phyllis Diller, look at Joan Rivers, look at Tony Fields. That is an anomaly. She appeared alone on stage in a shimmering evening dress, dripping with diamonds, and wore a make. And her monologues were about how her spouse drove her crazy. Does that sound familiar? It sounds very familiar, doesn't it? And her children. Male comics, Alan King, that was his bread and butter, wasn't it? It confused the audience. Now let me ask you something. If a female got up here and did a stand-up routine, would it confuse you? No. But back in the day, it confused the audiences. She was a radical, a lone woman with a microphone and an audience eating out of the palm of her hand. For a female comic to wield that sort of power was often unheard of, especially in the smoke-filled universe of nightclubs. Remember what Jerry Lewis said? She would set the stage for women like Phyllis Diller and Joan Rivers. The vaudeville burlesque stars, the radio stars. She went from vaudeville burlesque to radio to stand-up. Fanny Brice wasn't a stand-up really. She built her career on Yiddish accent, as flair for zany parody. She was in burlesque and in vaudeville and in drama and film and musical reviews, including 9 Ziegfeld Follies between 1910 and 1936. One sketch she appears in as a toddler, Baby Snooks, and she delighted audiences with a thoroughly believable impression, complete with a hair ribbon, starched pinafore, ankle socks, Mary Jane's. Snooks would lead Fanny Brice to the stardom she desired, and she has not been forgotten. Most of these people have been forgotten. Well, a revival of Funny Girl. How many saw Funny Girl? Right? Funny Girl. Barbra Streisand, by the way, was the 6th choice of the producers. The #1 choice was Mary Martin, and she said, no, this has to be a Jewish person doing this. And but Barbara was the 6th choice. The play opened on Broadway in 1964 with Barbra Streisand as Fanny Brice, and it was revived last year. Gracie Allen and George Burns, Nathan Beerbaum. There they are together. George wrote most of the material and played the straight man, and Gracie Allen was the silly woman. But early on, she was the straight man and he was the silly one in the duo. But they noticed people were laughing at Gracie's straight lines, so George Burns said, you know what, let's switch it. I'll be the straight man, you be the silly woman. And it worked. It worked. On their radio show, George would end with the line, say goodnight, Gracie. And Gracie would say, goodnight, Gracie. Rowan and Martin's Laughing in the 1960s and 70s would see the host, or co-host, Dan Rowan, talking to his partner, Dick Martin, the co-host, and he would say goodnight, Dick. There'd be a whole bunch of people saying, say goodnight, Dick, and Dick would end the show by saying, say goodnight, Dick. An ode to Gracie Allen. Most talented woman ever in radio. Most talented person ever in radio. There was nobody as talented as Gertrude Byrne. She was absolutely the top. You may ask about Jack Benny, because he had that successful radio show for about 23 years. He was a performer on the show. You might ask about Bob Hope. He's a performer on the show. Fanny Brice, she's a performer on the show. She did it all. 20,000 scripts she wrote. That's part of the 20,000 scripts. She was born Tilly Elderstein in New York City in 1898. Her father, Jake, ran a Catskills resort. Can you imagine what a Catskills resort was like in 1912? I went to Kutcher's in the dying days of Kutcher's, and Mrs. Kutcher, 2005, 2006, said to me, watch, be careful when you walk in the lobby, because some of those floorboards have worn out, you might fall through them. She was 14 when she came up to the Catskills and started to work. Her job was to entertain the guests, children. This is the Catskills, you know, Dirty Dancing and all, and Singles Weekend. I don't know if any of you went to Singles Weekend. up there. My wife said she did it in the 1970s. I said, well, how was it? She said, I married you, didn't I? She didn't mean anybody. Anyway, so she meets this older English gentleman by the name of Louis Berg, and he woos her, and she's 18 in 1916, and they get married. They move to New Orleans because, after all, he's the guy in the family, he's making the money, he's an engineer on the sugar plantation, except the sugar plantation burns down. Tilly and Louis return to New York, and she decides, you know what, I want to be an actor, and I want to write. And I'm changing my first name to Gertrude. And I'm taking my husband's name. Well, it's my name too now, Berg. So she becomes Gertrude Berg, taking her husband's last name. And she writes about, starts writing scripts about a fictional family in the Bronx. Jewish immigrants assimilated into the United States, the Goldbergs. Gold is her mother's maiden name. Her name now is Berg, so she puts them together. The Goldbergs premiered on NBC Radio in 1929. And Gertrude had no real want to play Mrs. Goldberg. She didn't want to do that. She wanted to write, but she couldn't find the right actress. One week she's sick, and the people listening missed her. Sent a massive amount of letters in saying, where's Molly? She was in it. And there she is, behind the NBC microphones. 1936, she signed a 5-year, $1 million contract with the sponsor, Procter & Gamble. By the end of the decade, she was making $7,500 a week. This is 1938-39, and starring in her own radio series. During the 1930s, only Eleanor Roosevelt was more respected than Gertrude Berg, according to Poll. That's Aviva Klempner, and she puts out DVDs. And over there, they might have some of Aviva's work. She did the Life and Times of Hank Greenberg. She was from Detroit, and her family knew all about Hank Greenberg. She also did the Moe Berg story, the baseball catcher who was a spy during World War II, and a few others. And I once asked Aviva, I said, what was your favorite DVD documentary to do? And she said, Yoo-hoo, Mrs. Goldberg. She loved it. Gertrude wrote and performed an original sketch for Channel 1 in New York, WNBT, part of RCA, NBC TV for short, 1940. And she also thought about, let's put the Goldbergs on stage, Broadway. Well, TV ended in 1941 after the bombing of Pearl Harbor and didn't really resume until 1946. She has a radio show in 1946, but she decides, let's do a Broadway one. And she does. Me and Molly made its Broadway debut in 1948. Lasted only 156 performances, about 20 weeks, but there was enough time, and she saw enough that, hey, let's put it on TV. And William Paley, Bill Paley at CBS said, sure, let's go. January 1949. And the Goldbergs premiered to significant fanfare and critical acclaim. But Sir Isaac Newton, I think he was sitting in a field somewhere when he got hit in the head with an apple, and he figured out what goes up must come down, right? And it's inevitable. What goes up must eventually come down, and that's what happened to the Goldbergs. There she is with Philip Loeb. They're on TV. Berg was the lead writer, star, producer, and the Goldbergs climbed in popularity. Oprah did her show. I mean, she didn't write the show. There was nothing really interesting about the Oprah show in terms of how it was put together. But Gertrude Berg was the writer, the star, and the producer, long before Oprah did all that, or did some of that. 1950, Gertrude Berg won the first Emmy as the Best Actress on TV. Show is also nominated for the Best Kinescope Show. The best way I could describe it, see the light coming out of the projector. You would put a camera there. You would shoot it at the screen and just film it. You develop the film, send it out to other TV stations. That was Kinescope. She published a cookbook. About 2 months ago, a woman said to me, I'm doing Gertrude Berg thing. And she said, I still have that cookbook. I said, yeah, where'd you get it? She said, I stole it. I said, stole it? She said, yeah, from the Brooklyn Public Library. Oh, I shouldn't say that in the library, should I? I said, you stole it from, well, it's a long story. My boyfriend, who became my husband, was going to Korea to fight in the war, and I simply forgot to bring it back. I said, how did you forget to bring it back? Didn't you get notices? She said, yeah, but I used it. And I figured they wouldn't miss it. I said, so how's the condition today? She says, it's held together by a rubber band, but I still use it. I said, does anybody in Brooklyn know that you still have it? She said, probably not. I said, well, I won't tell if you won't tell. Anyway, so she published a cookbook, wrote an advice column called Mama Talks. The television show was made into a movie, Molly, by Paramount Pictures. She's on the set, in the editing room. She's in the editing room. When Oprah was in the movie, she was not in an editing room. She was the screenwriter and the producer. But what goes up must come down. And it would. Blacklist, McCarthy days, back in the late 40s and 50s. The House on Un-American Activities published red channels. The report of communist influence in radio and television. Gertrude's co-star, Philip Loeb, an active union organizer among actors, was listed. And there is red channels, and this creates a major problem. Sponsors pulled their support for the show. Gertrude was faced with a dilemma. Find a new sponsor or fire Loeb. And she wasn't going to fire Loeb. He was her friend, and they were great together on the show. Well, she appealed to the sponsors in the network. And even New York's Cardinal Francis Spellman, who told her, yeah, I'll help. But you got to convert from Judaism to Catholicism. And she said, later for you. CBS made employees take loyalty oaths in 1950 and kept bothering her, get rid of Loeb, but she refused to do it. The sponsor, General Foods. General Foods had Jell-O. General Foods comes back again a little later on in this talk. They canceled the Goldbergs in 1951. CBS said goodbye, and the sponsor, General Foods, maker of Jell-O, which is wobbly, right? General Foods was wobbly too. The show was put on hold for 2 years. She did get NBC to put it back on. She replaced Loeb with Harold Stone and Robert Harris eventually for Loeb. Sponsors and viewers were scarce on NBC. The show was canceled. Dumont, which had no money, picked up the show, but the Goldbergs' time had passed. Senator Joe McCarthy, who rose to prominence after being just a backbencher with a speech in Wheeling, West Virginia in February 1950, saying that there were all kind of communists in the State Department, even though he couldn't produce one card-carrying communist, and blacklisting one. Gertrude was also blacklisted because she was a communist supporter through her association with Loeb. There's Loeb. Loeb in 1955 committed suicide. Took sleeping pills, checked into the Taft Hotel in Midtown Manhattan under a false name. Again, you might see the movie in here. It's called The Front, with Woody Allen and Zero Mostel, done in the mid-1970s, where the Zero Mostel character is based totally on his good friend, Philip Loeb. Oh, Lucy. Lucy was never a stand-up comic. She never performed in front of an audience doing a stand-up. So you get into this little gray area. Gertrude Berg wasn't a stand-up. Moms Mabley was. Jean Carroll was. But she did physical comedy, right? And you know, the whole show, the whole Lucy show was extremely fun. 1950. CBS approached Lucille Ball about doing a weekly program on television. She had been on radio for the prior 2 years, My Favorite Husband, which was a hit on CBS radio. And she jumped at the chance, but she had some, she thought, leverage. And this is a woman who bounced around for 20 years before getting some piece of stardom with the radio show. But she had been around since 1928. She saw everything in the business, everything in the business. So she says, okay, you want me? this is what I want. I want my real-life husband, Desi, Cuban exile, thrown out of Cuba in 1933 during the Sergeant's Revolt. He's going to play my husband on television, possibly to save our marriage. Well, CBS said, no, can't do. General Foods, Jell-O, again, the potential sponsor, thought that the American public would never ever accept Desi as the husband of a red-blooded American girl who came from Jamestown, New York. Jell-O and CBS insisted that her My Favorite Husband radio co-star Richard Deming continued as her co-host, because if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Philip Morris came in to replace Jell-O. Lucy wanted to save the marriage, and it's working together. They were married. They were legally married in Connecticut in 1940. They were married legally. Keep that in mind. Ball told CBS, hey, you want to do the show? You get both of us. You don't get one of us. The network wanted Lucy, really wanted Lucy, and said, okay. All right, Desi, yeah, even though he's a Cuban, he has that strong Cuban accent. Okay. Oh, one other thing. They were an interracial or multi-ethnic couple. And now you'll see why CBS and General Foods got cold feet. Yeah, they were legally married. But you have to go back, at that point, 73 years to understand why there was so much trouble putting I Love Lucy, or the original name I Love Lopez, which would never have flown, on the air. Rutherford B. Hayes became president of the United States in March of 1877. America's civil rights movement has been stalled, or was stalled, since 1875. Desegregation in the South ended with the Rutherford B. Hayes, Samuel J. Tilden presidential race in 1876. Hayes became president after the Southern Democrats cut a deal with the Republicans. Democrats wanted federal troops out of South Carolina and Louisiana and other places in the South, and they said, you do that, you can have the Oval Office. You can install Hayes as president. And that's what happened. Oh, by the way, interracial marriage was illegal in more than a dozen states in 1875, 76, and 17 states in 1950. So they go on tour in 1950, and they are going to prove to an audience that they can be believable as a married couple, even though they had been in movies before. In fact, that's where Lucy met Desi in 1940 in a movie. During the summer of 1950, they show audiences, hey, we're funny, we can do this, this, and this. And by the way, do you think the audience worried that they were an interracial couple when they saw them? No. The answer was no. 1951, they produced a film pilot for the series with their own money. CBS didn't have to put up money. The show got on. Lucy fully expected the show to end just after 1 year because of all the problems that they had, and would have. Smash hit. There's Desi, there's Lucy, Vivian Vance, and William Frawley. Oh, by the way, how many of you still watch I Love Lucy? Or have watched, or I Love Lucy? It's still on TV somewhere. What was the most important relationship in that show? Was it Lucy and Desi, or Lucy or Ethel? Ethel. It was with Ethel. And they were kind of the forerunners of women's lib, not allowing the husbands to walk all over them, right? Even though they would fail in the end. Oh, hello? This is your mother speaking. You remember her? Your mother? You never called. Elaine May. She was a comedian, writer, director, performer, founding member of the Chicago Improv Comedy Theater Group, Second City. And she gets recognition in the early 1960s for her dry, witty technique in the comedy duo of Nichols and Mann. She went on to write, direct, and perform on Broadway and in motion pictures. 1950, she attended the University of Chicago where she met Mike Nichols. 1955, she joined the Compass Theater where she and Nichols and a number of other notable comedians performed improv comedy. They included Shelley Berman, remember him, his phone routine, Alan Arkin, the actor, Barbara Harris, and they formed the Second City Improv Comedy Group. During their time in Second City, Elaine May and Mike Nichols formed a comedy duo. They hit the road, the two of them. By 1960, they had a show on Broadway, An Evening with Nichols and May. And it ran for 306 performances, October 8, 1960 to July 1st, 1961. They released a comedy record, An Evening with Mike Nichols and Elaine May. They won the 1961 Grammy Award for Comedy Performance. From 1964 to 65, she was on the satirical news program, which started in England, called That Was the Week That Was. That was the week that was. I still remember the show. I watched that show when I was 8 years old. I still remember the performers on the show, even though there are hardly any videos of that show from the United States on YouTube. That was the week that was. It was a show, first of its kind, news and comedy. Tom Lehrer was on the show, Alan Sherman was on the show, Elaine May and a whole bunch of others, and Nancy Ames was the was the TW3 girl, and she sung the song, which changed every week to open the show. 1972, she directed The Heartbreak Kid, the Neil Simon script movie. And she would eventually earn 2 Academy Award nominations for screenwriting. 1978 film, which Warren Beatty updated, called Heaven Can Wait. Here Comes Mr. Jordan, 1941. And Primary Colors, which was about the presidential campaign in 1992. That came out in 1998. You saw Jean Carroll, right? And you see Phyllis Diller. Notice the difference? Phyllis Diller is the most unlikely of big-time comedians. She was raucous, zany comedian, self-depreciation, flat-out self-mockery. She was born in Lima, Ohio, studied the piano at the Sherwood Conservatory in Chicago, moved on to Bluffton College in Ohio, and she was going to become a music teacher. She met Sherwood Diller, and they married in 1939. They would work together, support a family, no vaudeville, no radio for Phyllis Diller, which makes her thoroughly unlikely to become a top comic at that particular time, because she did vaudeville, burlesque, and radio, or early TV. Her big break is with this guy, Groucho Marx, on You Bet Your Life. And she goes toe-to-toe with Groucho as a guest. She was working as a journalist for the San Leandro News Observer. She's also doing literally open mics, and she gets on to a Groucho show. The Purple Onion in San Francisco watched her, and they invited her, and she knocked them dead. Dynamic one-liners in her costume. And she would end up at New York's Blue Angel, and there was an appearance on the Jack Moore show. Well, she wasn't that unlike Jean Carroll. She was the typical housewife, spoke of topics that affected American suburbia, kids, pets, neighbors, mothers-in-law. Fang, that was her big routine, Fang, the fictional husband. She made faces, laughed at her own jokes with that laugh, overdone makeup, and had the cigarette dangling from the cigarette holder. And she would make fun of Fang. She ended up on the Jack Paar show, which was the big time. There were, in 1950s, there were 2, Ed Sullivan and Jack Paar. I got my national exposure on the Jack Paar show. My first big turning point, Ron, was Groucho. And several movies with Bob Hope really boosted my career. The Fang routine got her in trouble. She divorced Sherwood Diller in 1965, married Ward Donovan. The Diller family, after the divorce, sued her over the Fang character, saying it was defamation. They settled out of court. Her routine included the fictional husband, Fang, whose idea of the 7-course dinner was a 6-pack and a bologna sandwich. The last time I said, let's eat out, we ate in the garage. Toady Fields. I had a woman 6 months ago said, you haven't talked about Toady Fields yet. While I was doing Phil Stiller's. She said, I'm walking out if you don't have her. I said, calm down. Put the next slide up. She was one of the funniest women in Las Vegas, and daytime TV shows. She was born in Hartford, Connecticut. She was singing on radio at an early age. She gave up singing and did stand-up, meeting her husband, George Johnston, in Boston at the age of 20. They moved to New York, and noticing her at the Copacabana was a guy by the name of Ed Sullivan. By the way, who were the two 1960s big brokers on TV that could launch a career? One was Sullivan. Who was the other? You know? Not, he was in the 50s. He was in the 50s. Well, we'll get to that in a minute. So, she's on the Sullivan Show. She used her size and weight as spoken material in the comedy act. She was an overweight Jewish woman. She was garlishly dressed and a low-class housewife. And she was also a tumbler at the clubs, entertaining between acts in New York City, the first woman to. Joan Rivers. I'm not going to ask you if you like her. I'm not going to ask you if you dislike her, because there is that, and there's no in between with Joan Rivers. You either loved her or absolutely despised her. So, but there's no in between, is there? There was no in between. 1960s, she's pushing the boundaries of taste and drawing grudging respect from her fellow stand-up comics in a largely male-dominated field. Nightclub managers were quick to fire her after some dicey performances. Audiences found her grating, some in the audience. And Joan Alinsky's parents regarded their daughter as a failure. Childless, divorced, unable to find steady work in the respectable profession. I started out with Max Torcelli. Being a comic a respectable profession? No, we're comics. She did not like the Catskills shtick. She went up to the Catskills. She was part of the Borscht Belt. She didn't like it. She was looking for something else. And she found inspiration in Lenny Bruce, the comic, who was a social critic, satirist, and a screenwriter. He was renowned for his open, freestyle, and critical form of comedy, which integrated satire, politics, religion, sex, and vulgarity. Oh, by the way, Francis Cardinal Spellman didn't help Gertrude Berle. He was no friend of Lenny Bruce. He and the New York District Attorney, Frank Hogan, conspired to bust Lenny Bruce in a Manhattan club after midnight. What did they expect? There were 9-year-old kids after midnight at a comedy club? Anyway, so he's arrested for being obscene, and he eventually would get a pardon from George Pataki long after he was dead. But that was Joan Rivers. That was her hero, or her idol. Oh, by the way, anybody watch Mrs. Maisel? The series? Mrs. Maisel. That was based on Joan Rivers. Well, Lenny Bruce paved the way for future outspoken counterculture era comedians, and the trial for obscenity seen as a landmark for freedom of speech in the U.S. Basically, Lenny Bruce was right to the core, and inspired Joan Rivers to shift from canned scripted material, Borscht Belt, to open discussions of her private life, ranging from an abusive childhood to making fun of her looks and lack of domestic abilities. Oh, the other guy who could make or break a career? Here's Johnny! Ed McMahon was 100 years old yesterday. It was his birthday, anniversary of his birthday. February 17th, 1965, the big break. Joan Rivers makes her first appearance on The Tonight Show in New York, starring Johnny Carson. Rivers credited this episode to be her big breakthrough. As Carson said to her on the air, "You're going to be a star." And she became a frequent guest and as close a friend as you can get to Johnny as you can, because apparently Johnny really didn't have close friends. Oh, she was on the circuit with Lenny Bruce, Woody Allen, still alive, Richard Pryor, George Carlin, and Dick Cavett, who's still alive. She counted them as peers and friends, but she never felt included with them because of sexist practices in the industry. She started to make guest appearances, numerous popular shows. Sullivan, Mike Douglas, Dick Cavett. Dick Cavett was once Johnny Carson's a writer, and he went against Johnny Carson on ABC in the late 1960s. Carson would watch his show and said, "Richard, this is where you need to improve." He would give him, even though it was a competition, pointers. Keep that in mind for a minute. Girl Talk with Virginia Graham. If you think The View is new, it's not. Virginia Graham had that show back in the 50s and 60s. Oh, and she wrote material for the Puppet Mouse Tokyo Jushio. Handicapped. Did you know that Joan Rivers was handicapped? Did you know that Joe Rivers was handicapped at all? Okay. This is the New York Times. Joe Rivers, a new comedian of ripening promise, who opened midweek for a 2-week run at the bitter end, is an unusually bright girl who's overcoming the handicap of a woman comic. Looks pretty and blonde and bright, and yet manages to make people laugh.
That's your handicap.
That's a handicap.
New York Times Review, 1965. She gets on to the Tonight Show. August 1983, Carson named Rivers as the first permanent guest host on the Tonight Show. She jokingly referred to her Tonight Show life as having been Johnny Carson's daughter, a reference to his longtime mentoring. But what goes up must come down, and all things must pass, right? And so did their friendship. This is in the 1980s, and Joe Rivers was the co-host, or was the permanent guest host, but something happened. Johnny Carson never spoke to his former Tonight Show protege again when she left to host her own Fox TV late-night program, started on October 9th, 1986. Now, let's review Carson a little bit. Carson's brother was Merv Griffin's right-hand man, literally. He was his producer-director, and Merv and Johnny knew each other from the game show days back in New York in the 50s and 60s. Merv was opposite Johnny. Nothing happened. Johnny's brother was still with Merv. I told you about Dick Cavett. Joey Bishop had a show opposite Johnny Carson on ABC. And on Johnny's 10th anniversary, Joey Bishop was one of the guests. So they were cool, but he wasn't cool with Joe Rivers. Johnny was the one person who said, yes, she has talent, yes, she's funny. Rivers wrote in an op-ed piece in 1986. He was the first person in power who respected what I was doing and realized what I could become. He handed me a career. In the same op-ed, Rivers explained that she took the offer in part because she was unsettled. When Carson's contract was renewed for 2 years, hers only for a year. Well, NBC thought that Carson was going to quit after 25 years in 1987. They had a short list of 11 people who could take Carson's spot. Joe Rivers wasn't on that list. The first person I called was Johnny, and he hung up on me.
Oh.
And never ever spoke to me again, and then denied that I called him. Rivers wrote in a 2012 column published in the Hollywood Reporter. Couldn't figure it out. I would see him in the restaurant, go over and say hello, he wouldn't talk to me. She was blacklisted from The Tonight Show. Finally came back with Jimmy Fallon. Rivers lost a late show gig in 1987. Wasn't welcome back to The Tonight Show. Jay Leno upheld her ban when he took over out of respect for Johnny, and Conan O'Brien banned her from the show as well. She was back March of 2014. Wayne Cotter, that's this guy's name. Carson could make or break a career. Carson could. Wayne Cotter is a comic who makes most of his money on cruise ships. I spoke on cruise ships prior to COVID-19. Wayne lives in Delaware right now, and he's been on TV on and off for years and years and years. So he's a stand-up comic from the Bronx. He spent nearly a decade on the circuit before getting on The Tonight Show. Cotter was one of the last new comedians to debut with Johnny. Johnny called him over to the couch. He had made it, and he went on to other shows, Politically Incorrect, Bill Maher, and he was the host of his own show on Fox called Comic Strip Live. I bring that up because Wayne told me Johnny could make or break a career. Made his career. He nearly broke Elaine Boozler's career. She began doing stand-up in the early 1980s after working as a waitress at the Improv. comedy club in New York City. Her act consisted of jokes about her experiences as a single, heterosexual woman and a comedian, and the impossible expectations of both. One such joke was her take on sexual double standard. Men want you to scream you're the best, while swearing you've never done this with anyone before. I know a comic by the name of Brian Bradley. He did some bit pieces on Seinfeld, and he was with my wife and me one day, and he said, wow, you know, he said to my wife, you remind me of Elaine Boozler, bright, personable, friendly, and that's what she was, bright, personable, friendly. And yet Johnny had a problem with it. She booked her first spot on The Tonight Show. Helen Reddy was the guest host in 1977. Later that year, Johnny's back. The producers said, no, we want you to use hacky self-depreciation material. And she said, no, I'm not. She used her own material. Afterwards, Carson reportedly told his comedy booker, I don't ever want to see that waitress on my show again. And that kind of ruined her career. 1985, she filmed Elaine Boozler, Party of One, but sat untouched for over a year. Eventually, new management took over at Showtime, and the special aired in 1986, only after the wife or one of the new executives said, you better put that on. I don't know what the rest of the threat was. It was an immediate success. Boozler went on to produce 3 more shows for Showtime, and now is regarded as one of the all-time women stand-up comics. Johnny Carson almost destroyed her career. One career that Carson launched, Roseanne Barr. 1985, she made her first appearance on The Tonight Show. Relatively unknown comic, joked about her status as a domestic goddess, her preferred term over housewife, and reoccurring shtick. And she would point out her weight. I'm fat. Just thought I'd point that out, and did an impression of Barbra Streisand. People watched The Carson Show, including 2 key Hollywood producers. Marcy Carsey and Tom Warner, who's part owner of the Boston Red Sox today. And they're doing a comedy series, and they're casting for the comedy series. They see Roseanne Barr, and they say, that's the one we want. And the show became Roseanne. Ellen DeGeneres, she also was invited to the couch. November 28, 1986, Johnny and the rest of the crowd thought she was hilarious, and she's called over to the couch. Shortly thereafter, people watch Carson. She got the role of Ellen Morgan on the ABC TV series These Friends of Mine. She was such a big part of the show, it was renamed Ellen. 1997, she revealed she was gay. The show was canceled. She came back to TV with The Ellen Show, which debuted in 2003. Carol Burnett. She's going to be 90 years old, or is 90 years old. There's going to be an NBC special, as I told you, on Carol Burnett. Sometimes you got to be lucky. You got to be lucky and get the right friends. Anyway, guest appearance with Gary Moore on the CBS Morning Show in 1956 led to increased exposure for the young comedian. She really wasn't a comedian. She was a comic actress. Gary Moore added Carol Burnett to the cast of the Gary Moore Show in 1959. Same year, she received excellent reviews, as well as a Tony nomination for her stage work in the Broadway musical comedy Once Upon a Mattress. And there was a famous redhead, really wasn't a redhead, she was a brunette, who used a lot of hair dye, sitting in the audience. Here she is. She was sitting in the audience. A chance meeting one night, 1959. Burnett found Lucille Ball and a lifelong friend. Lucy came to see the play, and after the show, she went backstage. She sought out Carol Burnett. The two chatted in the dressing room for about 30 minutes. She called me kid because she was 22 years older than I. Just as she was leaving, she said, kid, if you ever need me for anything, give me a call. How many people have told you that? And you never made the call? Because she didn't believe it. Well, she made the call. CBS said, we'd like you to do a 1-hour special, but you got to understand, variety shows really are the domain of women, not men. In fact, there was Dinah Shore, and there was Dinah Shore, and there was Dinah Shore. I can't think of anybody else. We'll give you the 1 hour, except you better have a big guest star to carry you. So her husband, Joe Hamilton, was the producer. He said, "Now, Lucy told you to call. Make the call." "I don't want to call." "Make the call." She makes the call. She said, "I'll be there." "When do you want me there?" And that was it. CBS then offered her another show, and she defied TV executives who cautioned her that such variety shows were a man's game, not for her. And Carol Burnett show was a major hit. 11 years. It was on 11 years. She was the host, singer, actress, comedian on every show, and there were movie parodies, What With the Wind, From Here to Eternity. Gilda Radner was on Saturday Night Live. She started with Second City comedy troupe in Toronto, the Toronto chapter, with John Candy and Dan Aykroyd, and Eugene Levy, and Joe O'Flaherty, and Rosemary Radcliffe, and Catherine O'Hara. She did characters like Emily Latilla, Nevermind, Roseanne Dana, and the punk rocker Candy Slice. But this was her main act, Baba Wawa. I can tell you stories about Barbara Walters. Hey, Shelley, put down the phone. I'll talk to you in 15 years. The late Shelley Saltman, who put on the Battle of the Sexes. He was the promoter of the Bobby Briggs, Billie Jean King tennis match. He was beaten up by Evel Knievel. Went to high school with her in Boston. And he said she had a lisp in high school. Her father, Lou, was running the Latin Quarter in Boston at that point. Baba Wawa became Walter's unofficial, unwanted nickname in the 1970s when Radner famously impersonated the newswoman on Saturday Night Live. At the time, Walters hated the impression, saying, "I don't talk that way. I do pronounce my R's." Shelley said she didn't. And it was a classic reoccurring character on Saturday Night Live. Party records! I listened to my first party record when I was about 7 years old. My uncles hid them in my parents' house, and I just put them up. Hey, what does this mean? I wish I kept those, right? I guess I can find them. 5 Jewish women, dirtiest women in comedy. Even dirtier than, say, Buddy Hackett. Patsy Abbott. Recorded 2 albums, Suck Up, You're Behind, and Have I Had You Before? Her nightclub act, brassy, sexual. She pushed back on the culture and insisted women's roles were demure mothers and housekeepers. But some of her songs and her act, you know, she knew the Vice Squad was there. So when she spoke about, sung about domestic matters, or sung about them, and the point was scatological, sexual, or simply to make a Yiddish, English, vulgar pun, she beat the Vice Squad because they didn't know Yiddish. The audience knew it. Bill Barth, the customer comes first. I could blow the whole network with one word, uncensored. A bawdy comedian who inspired Bette Midler. Belle Barth narrowly avoided trouble with the law by delivering some of her most wicked punchlines in Yiddish. She was on the vaudeville circuit in the 30s and 40s and did impressions of Sophie Tucker and Al Jolson, Gypsy Rose Lee, but she came up with her original routines in the 1950s. Raunchy stand-up, capitalizing on the emerging field of adult comedy that emphasized overtly sexual material. Some of the albums she recorded included If I Embarrass You, Tell Your Friends. She performed in New York, Miami, Las Vegas, and Los Angeles. Occasionally she was too drunk to tone down her act. She was arrested in Miami Beach of all places. Miami Beach of all places. For $25, she was arrested. I guess one of the cops knew Yiddish in 1952. Ruth Wallace, Ruth Wall, Boobs. That's it, Boobs. That was her album. 19 classic songs from the Queen of Party records, from the original master. She began her career as a legit singer with Isham Jones and Betty Goodman on the road, but she gained fame in the 1940s and 50s for her risque, satirical songs rife with double entendres that she wrote herself. One time she went to Australia to perform. All of her records were seized, and they thought, well, we're going to have this woman around. It got more people to go see her in concert. Oh, my old Facebook friend, Rusty Warren, who passed away a couple of years ago. Knockers Up. Knockers Up. And more Knockers Up. Bawdy comedy, so outrageous for its time, especially coming from a woman. She was banned from radio and TV, and yet sold about 3 million copies of her 4 million copies of her party records. Knockers Up could be used as a march like ditty in the pre-women's lib days for women's rights. She sold a lot of records, even though she was banned from radio and TV. Oh, she was legit. She studied at the New England Conservatory of Music, graduated in 1954. Her musical mentor was Arthur Fiedler, conductor of the Boston Pops. Pearl Williams, not doing the Irving Berlin song, she's doing What Comes Naturally. 1952, a heckler is telling her, get off the stage, your jokes are horrible. And she said, oh, no, the audience howled. She became a hit. She released 9 best-selling party records. Patsy Abbott opened her own club because these women couldn't play the Borscht Belt, the Catskills, even though Buddy Hackett probably was as dirty as they were, or Tubby Boots was dirtier. Barth, Williams, and Abbott, they weren't welcome. They played Miami Beach and New York and Toronto, the late night slot, where the crowds were drunk or rowdier and more open to having a good time. Patsy Abbott opened up Patsy's Place in Miami Beach. Barth and Williams played smaller rooms at noted hotels like the Fontainebleau or New York nightclubs, but they weren't El Morocco or Latin Quarter. Barth did play Carnegie Hall, but she had to censor her material. So it's a long way to go as we wrap this up. There is Amy Schumer. Prior to COVID-19 and the pandemic, more were involved because stand-up comedy classes, or stand-up comedy was a booming business with more clubs, more stand-up classes, but they weren't paying money. You got up there on open mic night. And the guys who figure, and women who figured out, hey, we're not getting money, but we can teach stand-up comedy. Teaching stand-up comedy, you're paying to learn how to be a stand-up comic instead of an open mic, because these people have been failures as comics. Netflix specials, Showtime specials. There's almost no money to most performers. There are about 10,000 amateur comedians in New York City. Why are they amateur? They've not gotten a nickel for their work. Diversity has grown as well. Most shows are overwhelmingly male and white dominated, but there are women to fill out the show. And the audience that enjoys comedy has grown to enjoy diversity with the comics. But it's a hard life for both men and women. Comedy Central's greatest women's stand-ups, Roseanne 100, women, Roseanne Barr, number 9. Ellen DeGeneres, 16. Phyllis Diller, 35. Joan Rivers, 44. Wanda Sykes, 70. Elaine Boosler, the waitress, 73. Brett Butler, 87. Paula Poundstone, 88. Sandra Bernhardt, 97. And Janine Garofalo, who could have been my cousin. She was dating Ben Stiller. They broke up at 99. That's Wanda Sykes, Ellen. Rolling Stone's list of the top 50 comedians. Joan Rivers, 6. Sarah Silverman, 31. Janine Garofalo, 33. Roseanne Barr, 38. Moms Mabley, the old timers here, 39. Phyllis Diller, 42. Amy Schumer, 43. Elaine Boosler, 47. Margaret Chow, 48. Wanda Sykes, 50. And a thank you to my friend Max Docelli, who is now on a cruise ship somewhere near Cabo, or I don't know where he is, but he told me he was flying out to San Francisco and doing the Mexican Riviera, and spoke to him the other day because we're working on, he's helping me on whittling down the list for the greatest Jewish comics of all time that I got to do in New Jersey on April 24th. And I said, I got 45 minutes? I said, I can't even say hello in 45 minutes with this. But we're gonna start with a picture of me, Max, and Freddie Rowan. Remember Freddie Rowan? And we're starting there. And Freddie's quote is, "Not everybody can be a stand-up comic like Suki Sales couldn't be." Anyway, thank you so much to Max, and thank you. Any questions?
Thank you.
Any comments? I'll put the lights on for you. And yeah, you could, any comments, any questions, or anything of that nature, go ahead. The floor is all yours.
How do people get free copies?
How do they